My name is Morgan Lawson. I'm 31 years old, and this Thanksgiving, my father gave me the only gift I never expected. He sold the company I built from the ground up and left me with absolutely nothing. The crisp November air bit at my cheeks as I pulled my SUV up the winding gravel driveway of the Lawson estate. In the passenger seat sat a leather portfolio, heavy with the weight of a $50 million signature. I tapped my fingers against the steering wheel, a nervous electric hum vibrating in my chest. This was it. 10 years of 80-hour weeks, skipped vacations, and missed birthdays had led to this moment. I had saved Lawson Logistics from the brink of bankruptcy 3 times, and this new contract with Global Haulage was the final jewel in the crown. I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror, my blonde hair pulled back into a tight professional knot, my blue eyes sharp and tired. I looked like a woman who was ready to lead. Today, at Thanksgiving dinner, my father would finally announce my promotion to CEO. He'd promised it since I turned 30. "Soon, Morgan," he'd say with that booming, charismatic laugh. "The throne is yours soon." As I stepped out of the car, the scent of roasting turkey and rosemary drifted from the house, thick and inviting. It felt like home, yet walking through the front door always felt like entering a courtroom. "Morgan, you're late," my father, Arthur, called out from the living room. He was standing by the fireplace, a glass of expensive bourbon in one hand, looking every bit the king of the castle in his cashmere sweater. "I was finishing the Global Haulage paperwork, Dad," I said, walking over to give him a brief, stiff hug. "It's signed, $50 million over 5 years. He didn't beam. He didn't even look at the portfolio I held out. He just nodded, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "Good. Professional to the end. That's my girl." "To the end?" I chuckled, though a small knot formed in my stomach. "I'm just getting started. I've already drafted the expansion plan for the Ohio hub." "Put the work away, Morgan," he said, finally looking at me. His eyes felt different, or perhaps just distant. "This is Thanksgiving. Let's focus on the family business." The way he said family business had a strange weight to it. I followed him into the dining room, where the table was a sea of silver and crystal. My stepmother and a few high-level executives from the firm were already seated. The atmosphere was festive, but there was an underlying tension, like a string pulled too tight. I sat at my father's right hand, the seat I'd occupied since I was a child. I felt a surge of pride. I had earned this spot. I had bled for that logo. I leaned over and whispered to him, "Are you going to do it before or after the turkey?" Arthur took a slow sip of his bourbon and set the glass down with a heavy clink. "Before," he whispered back. "I think everyone should know exactly where they stand before we eat." I smiled, my heart racing. I reached under the table and squeezed my own hand, telling myself to breathe. This was the moment my life would finally begin. The dining room was a portrait of American success. A 20-pound turkey sat at the center of the table, skin glistening and herb-scented steam rising toward the chandelier. My father cleared his throat and stood up, his silver hair catching the light. He tapped his crystal glass with a spoon, a sharp, ringing sound that cut through the polite chatter. "Friends, family, colleagues," Arthur began, his voice booming with its practiced authority. "Today is about gratitude, but for Lawson Logistics, it's also about a new beginning. I've spent 40 years building this legacy, and I've reached a realization. A man knows when it's time to hang up his coat." I felt a thrill of anticipation. I adjusted my blazer, preparing to stand when he called my name. I looked at the executives across the table. They were avoiding my gaze, staring intently at their wine. My stomach gave a small, uneasy flip. "I have officially signed an agreement to sell Lawson Logistics in its entirety to Vance Holdings." The air left my lungs as if I'd been punched. Vance Holdings? Sterling Vance was a vulture. He didn't build companies, he gutted them. He was the man I had spent the last 3 years fighting in every bidding war from Chicago to Newark. "Dad?" I whispered, my voice sounding small in the suddenly silent room. "What are you talking about? We just landed global haulage. We're stronger than ever." He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes on the room. "The sale is final. Vance will take over operations starting Monday. He's looking to consolidate, to streamline. And as for me, well, I'm looking forward to a very comfortable retirement in Florida." "And me?" I stood up, my chair screeching against the hardwood floor. "What about my CEO appointment? What about my shares?" Finally, Arthur turned to me. His expression wasn't one of apology, it was one of mild annoyance, as if I were a child interrupting a serious conversation. "Morgan, be reasonable. Sterling is bringing in his own executive team. There's no room for you in the new structure." "No room?" I felt the heat rising in my neck, a stinging, prickly sensation. "I built the infrastructure you just sold. Those shares you promised me for 10 years, the equity I earned while you were off playing golf and I was managing the 2024 supply chain crisis, where is my cut?" Arthur sighed, a long, weary sound. "I checked the filings, Morgan. Those promises were never formalized on paper. The company was in my name. I'm liquidating everything to cover the transition and my own expenses. You're a talented girl. You'll find something else. You've got a great resume now." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small, gold-foiled envelope. He slid it across the white linen tablecloth toward me. "I wanted to make sure you had a little something for the holidays." I opened it with trembling fingers. It wasn't a check, it wasn't a contract, it was a $500 gift card to Neiman Marcus. "You're out of the deal, Morgan." His voice was flat and final. "Now let's eat. The turkey is getting cold." I looked around the table. No one moved, no one defended me. They all just picked up their forks, the soft clatter of silver against china sounding like the closing of a coffin lid. My father didn't just sell the company, he sold me, and he did it while I was holding the contract that made him rich. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I picked up my leather portfolio, tucked the insulting gift card inside, and walked out of the room. The last thing I heard was the sound of my father laughing at a joke one of his cronies had made. The cold air hit me again outside, but this time I didn't shiver. I felt a strange, icy clarity. He thought I was just a Lawson girl who would marry well and disappear. He thought he owned the board. He forgot one very important thing. I didn't just manage the company. I built the machine that ran it, and I knew exactly which bolt to pull to make the whole thing scream. My apartment was too quiet. Usually, the silence felt like a reward after a day of shouting over engine hums and dispatch radios. But tonight, it felt like a vacuum. I sat on my floor, the designer rug I'd bought to celebrate my 5-year anniversary at the company now feeling like a mockery. I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat in the blue glow of my laptop, watching the cursor blink. The first thing I did was dig. My father was a man of expensive tastes and even more expensive secrets. I'd spent years cleaning up his accounting errors, but I'd always done it out of loyalty. Now I looked with a predator's eyes. It didn't take long. Hidden under layers of consulting fees and offshore transfers were the jagged remains of a gambling habit that had finally outpaced his pride. He hadn't sold the company to retire, he'd sold it to stay out of a cage. But then I remembered the dinner, Arthur's face when he said he'd sold everything. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. I stood up, my joints popping, and went to the back of my closet. I pulled out a dusty plastic crate filled with college notebooks and old hard drives. Back in my junior year at MIT, I'd been obsessed with logistical efficiency. I'd written a code, a predictive routing algorithm that could cut fuel costs by 22% and predict traffic bottlenecks before they happened. I'd named it Artemis. When I joined Lawson Logistics, I implemented the software. It was the secret sauce that made us beat every competitor. But I remembered the day I'd set it up. My father had been too busy at a gala to sign the internal IP transfer. He told me, "Just get it running, Morgan. We'll handle the paperwork later." Later never came. I'd been smart enough, or perhaps cynical enough even back then, to host the core source code on a private server owned by ML Innovations, a shell company I'd formed for a class project. Every year I'd renewed the domain. Every year I'd paid the server costs out of my personal pocket. I opened my laptop and logged into ML Innovations portal. There it was, the heart of Lawson Logistics, the engine that Sterling Vance thought he had just bought. I pulled up the sales agreement Arthur had sent to my personal email as a courtesy. I scanned the fine print. Seller transfers all physical assets, including vehicles, real estate, and existing client contracts. It didn't mention proprietary software licenses. Arthur didn't even know they existed. He thought the software was just a part of the computers, like the paint on the trucks. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Sterling Vance. "Morgan, I'm at the office. We're doing a systems migration tonight to prep for Monday. We can't bypass the admin encryption on the dispatch server. Send the master key now." I stared at the screen. The arrogance of the man was breathtaking. He had just helped my father rob me, and now he wanted me to hand him the keys to the vault. I didn't reply. Instead, I reached for my glass of wine, took a slow sip, and began typing a very different kind of message. If they wanted a streamlined company, I was about to give them exactly what they asked for. I was going to give them a company that couldn't move a single box. I ignored Sterling's text. I let it sit there, the notification bubble a tiny, pulsing reminder of his desperation. I could almost picture him, standing in my glass-walled office, smelling of expensive cologne and impatience, wondering why the world wasn't bending to his will. I leaned back, the plastic of my desk chair creaking. I had a choice. I could be a good girl, hand over the keys and hope for a decent recommendation, or I could burn the bridge and use the light to find a new path. I chose the fire. With a few keystrokes, I entered the back end of the Artemis server. The interface was clean, a grid of moving blue dots representing every Lawson truck currently on the road across 48 states. I clicked the License Management tab. There it was, status active. I changed it to pending revocation. I set a timer. In exactly 48 hours, midnight on Sunday, the license expired screen would lock every terminal at Lawson Logistics. No routes, no fuel optimization, no driver logs. Without Artemis, the company wasn't a logistics giant. It was just a bunch of expensive, stationary metal. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, rhythmic thumping. I took a breath, the air in my apartment tasting of stale coffee and cold ambition. This was the point of no return. I picked up my phone, but I didn't text Sterling back. Instead, I scrolled through my contacts until I hit a name that made my pulse jump: Marcus Henderson. Marcus was the CEO of Global Haulage. He was a man who valued two things: efficiency and loyalty. He'd signed that $50 million contract because he trusted me, not the man whose name was on the building. I hit dial. It was nearly 11 p.m. on the Friday after Thanksgiving. He answered on the third ring, his voice gravelly and alert. "Marcus, it's late for a victory lap. I assume the paperwork is already being processed." "Marcus," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "I'm calling because there's been a change in leadership. My father sold the company to Sterling Vance this afternoon. He did it without my knowledge." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end. I could hear the distant sound of a television in the background, then the click of it being turned off. Vance, Marcus spat the name like it was spoiled milk. I don't do business with Vance. He's a cost cutter. He'll dilute the service to pad his margins. Why didn't you stop this? I was fired, Marcus. Cut out of the deal entirely. My father didn't just sell the company, he sold the contract I just gave you. I paused, letting the weight of the betrayal hang in the air. But he made a mistake. He doesn't own the software that runs the fleet. I do. You own Artemis? Marcus sounded intrigued now, the irritation replaced by a sharp, business-minded curiosity. Every line of code, and as of Sunday night, Lawson Logistics doesn't have a license to use it. I'm starting my own firm, Lawson & Co. I have the tech, I have the driver's loyalty, and I have the vision. What I don't have is your contract, yet. I waited, my thumb hovering over the end call button. This was the gamble. The global haulage contract has a key person clause, said Marcus slowly. If you're at the helm, the contract is voidable. I put that in there as a formality, Marcus. I didn't actually think I'd have to use it. Use it, I whispered. Give me 30 days. I'll have a new fleet and a new hub. Don't let Vance gut your business. You've got balls, Morgan Lawson, Marcus chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. Most people would just take the gift card and cry. Tell you what, you get your doors open in 30 days and the contract is yours. But if you miss a single delivery, I'm gone. Clear? Crystal. I hung up and let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for a decade. My phone screen lit up again. Sterling Vance, 11:14 p.m. Morgan, I'm losing my patience. Your father said you'd be difficult. If I don't have those codes in an hour, I'm calling the company lawyers for theft of trade secrets. I smiled, a real sharp-toothed smile that reached my eyes. I typed back the first words I'd said to him all night. Morgan, 11:15 p.m. Check the IP registry, Sterling. You didn't buy the secrets. You just bought a very expensive pile of scrap metal. Happy Thanksgiving. The Saturday morning after Thanksgiving didn't smell like leftovers and gratitude. It smelled like diesel exhaust and stale coffee. I pulled into the parking lot of the Rusty Hub, a diner 2 miles from the main Lawson depot. This was where the real heart of the company beat, not in the mahogany-paneled boardrooms, but in the grease-stained booths where drivers complained about logbooks and bad transmissions. I walked inside, my high-end wool coat feeling out of place among the flannel and high-visibility vests. The bell above the door chimed, and a dozen heads turned. The chatter died down. In the corner booth sat Big Sal Moretti. He had been with my father since the company had only 3 trucks, but for the last 5 years, he'd taken his orders from me. Morgan, Sal said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't stand, but he gestured to the empty seat across from him. Heard the news. Word travels fast when a man sells his soul. He didn't just sell his soul, Sal. He sold yours, too, I said, sliding into the booth. The vinyl was cracked and cold. I looked around the room. At least 20 of our best drivers were watching us. Vance is already talking about optimization. You know what that means. Automatic speed governors on every rig, cut-rate insurance, and a 10% pay slash to realign with market standards. A murmur of discontent rippled through the diner. We're loyal to the name, Morgan, an older driver named Pete called out from the counter. Your old man, he's a Lawson. My old man is in a beach house in Florida while you're calculating how to pay your mortgage on Vance's wages, I snapped, leaning forward. I let my voice carry. The name on the door is Lawson, but the woman who made sure your checks cleared and your routes were safe is sitting right here, and I'm leaving. Sal narrowed his eyes, stirring his coffee slowly. Leaving to go where? You're Lawson, but you don't have a fleet. You don't have a yard. I have the software, I said, dropping my voice just enough for them to lean in. At midnight tomorrow, Lawson Logistics goes dark. Every terminal, every GPS, every dispatch board. It's mine, and I'm taking it with me. I'm starting Lawson & Co. I have the global haulage contract, but I need the muscle to move the freight. That's a hell of a gamble, Morgan, Sal whispered. That's industrial sabotage. No, Sal, that's reclaiming my property. I pulled a stack of papers from my bag, simple one-page intent to hire forms. I can't offer you a fancy office, I can't even offer you a truck today, but I can offer you a stake, a real one, equity in the new firm for the first 50 drivers who sign. We'll lease the rigs, we'll run the Artemis code, and we'll leave Arthur and Sterling holding an empty bag. I set the papers on the table. The diner was silent again. I could feel the sweat prickling at my hairline. If they didn't come with me, I was just a woman with a laptop and a grudge. Sal looked at the paper, then at me. He saw the fire in my eyes, the same fire I'd used to save his job when my father wanted to fire him after a minor fender bender 3 years ago. He picked up a greasy ballpoint pen and signed his name in heavy, jagged script. I never liked Sterling Wance anyway, Sal grunted, sliding the paper back. Too much hair gel, not enough grit. One by one, the men and women in the diner stood up. The sound of chairs scraping across the floor was the most beautiful music I'd ever heard. They didn't just sign, they started calling other drivers. The rebellion was no longer a plan, it was a landslide. As I walked out of the diner an hour later, my phone screamed in my pocket. It was Arthur. I let it ring until it went to voicemail, then listened to the message. "Morgan, what have you done? Sterling says the servers are throwing errors. He's threatening to sue me for breach of contract. You get down to the office and fix this right now, or so help me, I will disown you." I deleted the message without a second thought. I couldn't disown someone who had already walked away. Sunday morning arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum. I spent the day in a rented co-working space that smelled of ozone and cheap floor wax, surrounded by 3 laptops and a mountain of legal pads. By noon, I had 48 signed intent to hire forms. By 3 p.m., I had secured a short-term lease on a small fleet of independent rigs whose owners were eager to jump ship from the sinking Vance empire. The tension in my chest was a living thing, a coiled spring waiting for the clock to strike 12. At 9 p.m., my phone rang. It wasn't a call, it was a FaceTime request from my father. I debated letting it ring out, but I wanted him to see my face when the lights went out. I answered. Arthur's face filled the screen. He looked older, his skin sallow under the harsh fluorescent lights of the Lawson Logistics dispatch center. Behind him, I could see Sterling Vance pacing, his tie loosened, barking orders at a terrified-looking IT tech. "Morgan," Arthur said, his voice uncharacteristically shaky. "Stop this madness. Sterling is willing to offer you a consultant role, 6 figures. Just give them the bypass code. The systems are starting to lag. We have 300 trucks hitting the road at midnight for the Monday morning rush." 6 figures, Dad? Is that more or less than the gambling debt you owe the Atlantic City syndicate? The blood drained from his face. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I saw the consulting ledgers, Arthur. I know why you sold me out. You didn't do it for a comfortable retirement, you did it because you were scared. But here's the thing, I'm not scared of you anymore, and I'm certainly not scared of Sterling." Sterling suddenly lunged toward the camera, his face twisted in a snarl. "Listen to me, you arrogant little brat. I bought this company. That includes the software. If those trucks don't move at midnight, I will strip you of every cent you have. I'll make sure you never work in logistics again." "You bought the hardware, Sterling," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. I looked at the digital clock on my laptop. 11:58 p.m. But the brain? The brain belongs to me, and I'm taking it back. "Morgan, please," Arthur begged, reaching toward the screen as if he could grab me. "This was my legacy." "No, Dad," I said, my finger hovering over the final enter key on my terminal. "This was my life. You just happened to have your name on the building." 11:59 p.m. I watched the seconds tick down. The dispatch center behind them was a hive of activity. I could see the massive monitors on the wall, the blue dots representing the lifeblood of the company. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I hit the key. On the video feed, the giant wall monitors didn't just flicker, they turned a violent neon red. A single sentence in white block letters appeared across every screen in the building. "License expired. Contact ML Innovations for support." The silence that followed through the phone was deafening. Then the chaos erupted. The phones began to ring, dozens of them at once. Those were the drivers, sitting in their cabs at truck stops and loading docks across the country, staring at blacked-out GPS units and locked electronic logs. "What did you do?" Sterling screamed, his voice cracking. "What did you do?" "I reclaimed my property. And Sterling, don't bother calling the lawyers tonight. My IP is registered in a Delaware shell. By the time you get a court date, I'll already have your clients." I ended the call. I sat back in the dark co-working space. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioner. I felt a strange sense of peace. The Lawson name was dead. The era of the daughter was over. The era of the CEO had begun. Monday morning arrived not with a sunrise, but with a storm. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the hotel suite I'd rented as a temporary war room. The smell of burnt coffee and ozone from my laser printer filled the air. My phone hadn't stopped vibrating for 4 hours. It hummed across the mahogany tabletop like a trapped insect. Most of the calls were from Sterling's legal team. I ignored them. The ones I answered were from the drivers. "Morgan, I'm sitting at a rest stop outside of Des Moines." Sal's voice crackled over the line, sounding tired but steady. "Vance's people are calling my personal cell, threatening to report the truck as stolen if I don't move. But the GPS is a brick. What's the word?" "The word is patience, Sal," I said, looking at a map of the Midwest pinned to the wall. "Leave the rig. There's a shuttle waiting at the diner next door to take you to the new hub in Omaha. Your signing bonus is already in your account. Let Vance worry about the towing fees." By noon, the industry news sites were already picking up the scent of blood in the water. "Lawson Logistics gridlocked," the headlines read. "Systems failure leaves thousands of tons of freight stranded." The doorbell to the suite chimed, not the friendly ring of a guest, but the frantic, heavy-handed pounding of a man who was watching his empire dissolve. I opened the door. Sterling Vance stood there, his expensive wool coat soaked through, his face a mottled shade of purple. Behind him, my father looked like a ghost of the man he'd been at Thanksgiving. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes hollow. "Get out of the way," Sterling spat, pushing past me into the room. He looked around at the laptops, the maps, and the stacks of driver contracts. "You think you're clever? You're a thief, Morgan. You've hijacked my trucks." "Technically," I said, closing the door and leaning against it, "your trucks are exactly where you left them. I haven't touched your hardware. I just stopped lending you my brain. If you want to move those rigs, you're free to hire 1,000 men with paper maps and pencils, but we both know you don't have the time." "Morgan, please." Arthur stepped forward, his voice cracking. He looked around the room, his eyes landing on a photo of my mother I'd placed on the desk. "You're destroying the family name, everything I built." You sold the family name, Dad, for pennies on the dollar to cover a debt you were too proud to admit to. I walked over to the desk and picked up a legal folder. And as for what you built, you forgot the foundation. I didn't just take the software, Sterling. I took the clients. Sterling let out a harsh, jagged laugh. Clients are loyal to contracts, not little girls with a vendetta. I have the global haulage agreement. It's ironclad. I corrected him. I pulled out a faxed document, the ink still warm. Marcus Henderson invoked the key person clause 3 hours ago. Since I'm no longer part of Lawson Logistics, the contract is null and void. And as of 10 minutes ago, he signed a letter of intent with Lawson & Co. The color drained from Sterling's face so fast I thought he might faint. He lunged toward me, but I didn't flinch. I just held up my phone, the screen showing a pre-dials 911. I have 50 drivers, the software, and your biggest client, I said, my voice low and dangerous. You bought a shell, Sterling. You bought the trucks, the debt, and the lawsuits that are about to hit you from every customer whose freight is rotting on the shoulder of the I-80. You'll sue you into the Stone Age, Sterling hissed, though the bravado was gone, replaced with a cold, sharp panic. With what money? I asked. Your investors are going to tear you apart when they realize you bought a logistics company that can't log anything. I turned to my father. He looked smaller than I ever remembered. Go home, Arthur, or go to Florida. Whatever's left of the sale money might cover your debts if you move fast, but don't ever call me his girl again. I opened the door and gestured for them to leave. Sterling marched out, a man defeated but too arrogant to admit it. My father paused at the threshold, looking back at me as if he were seeing a stranger. He didn't think you had it in you, he whispered. I know, I said, and for the first time in years, the words didn't hurt. That was your biggest mistake. The weeks leading up to Christmas didn't feel like a holiday. They felt like a siege. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't fighting for someone else's name. The new headquarters of Lawson & Co. was a far cry from the glass and steel tower Arthur had occupied. We were operating out of a renovated warehouse in New Jersey, right on the edge of the shipping docks. The air here was thick with the scent of salt spray, wet asphalt, and the constant rhythmic thumping of containers being loaded onto ships. It was gritty, it was loud, and it was perfect. I stood on the mezzanine balcony, looking down at the floor below. Banks of monitors glowed with the familiar blue dots of Artemis, my software, now running on a dedicated, secure server. Below, Sal was orchestrating a group of new dispatchers, his booming laugh echoing off the corrugated metal walls. My phone buzzed on the railing. It was a news alert. Vance Holdings files for Chapter 11, Lawson Logistics acquisition cited as fatal blow. I felt a brief flicker of something, not joy exactly, but a deep, settled sense of justice. Sterling Vance had tried to buy a shortcut to success, and instead, he'd purchased a black hole. He was being sued by investors and creditors alike. The vulture had finally found something he couldn't stomach. The office door creaked open behind me. I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. The heavy, expensive scent of sandalwood gave him away before he even spoke. "It's a bit drafty in here, isn't it?" Arthur said. I turned. My father looked like he'd aged a decade in a month. His suit was still expensive, but it hung loose on his frame. The booming charisma was gone, replaced by a cautious, almost fragile demeanor. "It's a working warehouse, Dad, not a country club," I said, crossing my arms. "What are you doing here?" He walked to the railing and looked down at the bustling floor. "I saw the news about Sterling. He's lost everything. The lawyers are coming for the estate next. They're saying the sale was fraudulent because the assets, the software, weren't mine to sell." "They weren't," I said simply. Arthur sighed. a ragged sound that caught in his throat. "I'm leaving for Florida tomorrow. Not to a beach house, though. Just a small condo my sister owns. I came to say that I've been talking to a lawyer about the debt. I'm going to declare personal bankruptcy." He looked at me then, his blue eyes watery and searching. I wanted to ask if there was a place for me here. Not as CEO, of course, but maybe as a consultant. I still know the players, Morgan. I still know how to close a deal. I looked at him, the man who sat at the head of a Thanksgiving table and told me I was worth nothing. I looked at the man who gambled away my sweat and tears to save his own skin. "No," I said. My voice was calm, devoid of the anger that had fueled me for weeks. "There's no room for you in this structure, Arthur. We're moving in a different direction. We value loyalty and transparency here." The silence between us was heavy, filled with the ghosts of 30 years of almosts and one days. "I see," he whispered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, familiar gold-foiled envelope. He set it on the railing. I looked down. It was the $500 gift card he'd handed me at Thanksgiving. "Keep it. You're going to need it more than I do." He nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. He didn't say goodbye. He just turned and walked toward the stairs, his footsteps echoing hollowly against the metal. I walked back into my office, a simple room with a desk, a laptop, and a window that overlooked the docks. On the corner of the desk sat a small Charlie Brown-style Christmas tree that Sal had bought for me. I sat down and opened my laptop. A new notification popped up from Marcus Henderson at Global Haulage. First 3 shipments arrived ahead of schedule. "Great work, CEO. Looking forward to 2026. I leaned back and looked out at the harbor. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in streaks of orange and gold. I wasn't just a Lawson girl anymore. I wasn't an assistant, a COO in waiting, or a pawn in a gambler's game. I was the founder. I was the owner, and for the first time in my life, the deal was entirely mine.